What is your favorite cutting board? That is a question that I've received dozens of times over the past few years, and so I decided today we are going to answer that question. What's up, knife nerds, and welcome back to the channel. This is the first video of 2023. My name is Frank Wallo, and this channel is all about knife knowledge, reviews, unboxings, and head-to-heads. And today we are answering the question, what is my favorite cutting board? Now you'll notice this isn't clickbait. The title of the video is not what is the best cutting board, it is what is my favorite cutting board. There is a huge difference there, and so we're going to talk about that. Now, without further ado, let's dive right into it. So, before I tell you what my favorite cutting board is, let me tell you what cutting boards we have. We have a plastic cutting board from Ikea. We have a plastic cutting board from Costco. Now, again, I also do want to say before I go to the next cutting board that these are not extensive. There are more than the cutting boards that you see before you out there in the world. These are just cutting boards that I have had the chance of using, trial testing, which is why I can decide if they're my favorite or not. Below the Costco plastic cutting board, we have a edge grain walnut cutting board, followed by an end grain cutting board, walnut, cherry, and maple. And then my absolute favorite cutting board, it's the one that sadly, it didn't fit in the frame. I swear I'm not trying to tease you guys, but it's this cutting board right here, this Larchwood Canada. Now, if you just wanted to know what was my favorite cutting board, let me tell you, this is probably a pretty good place to stop, because after this, as much as you know, I always try to keep things short. I talk science, I talk plants, reproductive biology, I get into the nitty gritty. I can't just tell you why it's my favorite cutting board. And yes, I know there's going to be some comments. Frankie, you should try a Hasegawa board. I don't have the luxury currently of having a Hasegawa board, so of course I cannot comment, but I'm fairly certain that if I were to try it probably would end up being one of my favorite cutting boards as well. However, it would not be the favorite cutting board because of a few reasons I can speculate for. So anyhow, if you're still listening to this, enjoy the rest of the video. Now let's dive into why some of these I like, some of these I don't recommend, and what I don't recommend at all. And what you don't have in front of you here, because I don't need to own one in my kitchen, or I don't need to own these in my kitchen. Never, ever, 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 ever buy a glass cutting board or a bamboo cutting board. There's a reason that we use in certain industries things like diamond to cut other stones, because something that is harder than something else will always do more damage. Glass cutting boards, bamboo cutting boards will do more damage than they do give benefits to your enjoyable home cooking experience. So those are two cutting boards that please, I never want you to ever get. If you're so desperate for money, man, I don't know, take newspaper, roll it a few times. That will be safer than using a glass cutting board or a bamboo cutting board. Also, never cut directly on the countertop. Now that I've set that aside, just in case someone were to say in the comments, but you never mentioned glass or bamboo. I just did. This cutting board right here, this is a plastic cutting board from Ikea. It's about as cheap a cutting board as you can get, and the reason I don't recommend this one in particular, none of this really has to do with price. It has to do with why are we using a cutting board in the first place. So if you're here watching my channel, you might be a new subscriber, you might be a returning subscriber. I have no idea. But what I can tell you is that typically the people that come here will invest in fine Japanese or non-Japanese kitchen knives. If you are investing in a tool, you want to increase the longevity of that tool. What you also want to do, because time is not limitless, it is limited, is you want to ensure that your knives stay as sharp as possible. Now, there's a lot of science around this, and I know some people are probably going to be throwing links at me. I'm a scientist, I understand the data, so I'm not going to dive into the science of it, but I will say, despite maybe what some of you think, that yes, the right cutting board can lengthen edge retention and also minimize edge chipping. Those are two of the most important reasons for using the right cutting board. So this Ikea cutting board, the reason it is not ideal is because it isn't even that hard of a plastic. But if we take a look at it a little bit closer, it has a very distinct pattern. It's textured. It's almost like this was soft molten polyurethane, and then some mold came and just put a bunch of little squares in it. So much so that if you were to just rest your blade on the cutting board itself, you can feel it wedge in without even pushing. It's stuck between the little squares. And so the danger there is that if you were to tweak by accident, you would likely chip your blade because it's literally being wedged between little plastic cubes at the microscopic level, but even at the macroscopic level, I can see them. You typically know if a cutting board is good for the edge of your knife, edge retention, by how many knife cuts you can see in the cutting board. In some of these cheap plastic cutting boards, sometimes you'll see lots of them because they also don't bounce back to their original shape, right? Every time you're cutting into the board, well, it's a knife, so it's cutting into the board, and the material is not necessarily healing, quote unquote. We'll get more into the details of what I mean by healing a little bit later, but this is why I don't recommend this cutting board. Is it better than glass and bamboo? Abso-freaking-lutely. But this is why it is not my favorite cutting board, because for edge retention or for edge chipability, it's not fantastic. But it's still better than glass and bamboo. Second cutting board is what now I will call a high quality plastic cutting board. High quality polyurethane, aka plastic. This is from Costco, and I love everything from Costco. And no, Costco did not give me money to talk about their cutting boards. I like it because as a soft cutting board, plastic, I like it because as a soft cutting board that is plastic, that has no patterns in it, right? Unlike the one from Ikea, it's absolutely smooth. Yes, it's true that you can see lots of the knife cuts, and it doesn't necessarily heal back in place. But what it is doing is it's very soft on the edge of my knife, because this plastic cutting board would rather take the knife cuts than say I will not move as a material, and therefore it ends up dulling the edge blade, so to speak. And so my main use for this is I like to use it for meats and for fish, raw typically. Not so much the cooked meats and fish. I like to do that because though my favorite cutting board below is absolutely fantastic for many reasons we will get to shortly, I just don't want to really scrub my cutting board, my wooden cutting board, with hot water and soap, which they recommend to desanitize. And so that's when I whip out this plastic cutting board. This one I have because I'm a compulsive, want to keep everything. And when do I use it? I don't know, maybe I use it when we need to chop walnuts for a banana loaf or cut chocolate. I don't really feel like cutting out on something else. I take a cheap knife that I don't care, probably an Ikea knife on the Ikea cutting board, and this is a match made in heaven for that. So everything has its use. But this plastic cutting board is my go-to for my chicken butchery, for my fish filleting, and for any sashimi, which I don't do very often, or almost at all. But anyhow, point is, raw protein, this is my plastic cutting board of choice. Now, the wooden cutting boards, of which I have 3 to choose from. This one is Beau Grain Walnut, and it is my first good quality cutting board. This was gifted to me by Becca. She found it at a market in Guelph, Ontario. And, oh, I'm about to sneeze. And initially, before I had the 2 cutting boards below it, this was my main cutting board. And it was fantastic for many reasons. It's absolutely attractive, all right? Let's not put that past that. That does count when we say my favorite, right? It's subjective, not always objective. And it being edge grain, what that essentially means, we'll get into that right now, because then when I'll mention the words edge grain and grain over and over, you'll have an idea of what that means. So, this is a treat. If you're looking at it the way my arm is posed in front of me, the grain going up, down, or down, up, that is edge grain. So what this is, in terms of type of cutting board, is this is the tree that was sawed in planks and turned on its side. So every time you cut with a knife, you're cutting against the grain, right? The wood fibers are running from left to right, right to left, and as I cut perpendicularly across the fibers, what does the blade edge meet? The blade edge meets into the fiber of the wood. And so every time I cut into the cutting board, I'm literally cutting the fibers of the wood. That is edge grain. Tree was like this, final product is like this. Knife cuts perpendicular through the fibers. So over time, you will see that, especially if you're an aggressive chopper, you will see chunks of wood that are missing. In fact, I can even see it in this case. And so since this cutting board is still functional, it's still gorgeous, the way I really use it has changed a little bit. I'll use it for kind of one-off opportunities. We eat a lot of pizza here, and so I maybe put in 8 slices into the pizza to divvy it up into its portions for Becca and I. So that's how I use this. I use this more now as a serving cutting board, as a finishing touch cutting board. I believe when I made the beef Wellington, I may have cut it here because all it was about 6 slices, so I'm not really thinking so much about edge retention on my knives. I'm thinking about a nice cutting board that I can present in front of people. I can put in a few knife cuts. It's not a huge deal. I'm not spending a huge amount of time on it. So this is a walnut edge grain cutting board, and I still keep it, but mainly for serving purposes and final touches. So let's put this one to the side. Next is a cutting board that I was initially so obsessed with that I really thought I wouldn't be getting anything else. Though funny enough, I got this after my favorite cutting board below. So this is a Beau Grain Atelier cutting board made from a maker in Quebec, the province in which I was born, and it is made out of 3 main woods. Walnut, which is mainly what you're seeing, and then there's little cute squares of maple and cherry. All 3 of these woods are hardwoods. Now this is an end grain cutting board, so the difference here now is, well, the tree's still going in the same direction, top up or bottom up. But now what they're doing to create a cutting board like this is they create discs into the tree. And so pretend you're cutting this tree in half and you're looking down the tree. Right now you're looking between the fibers. And so as you look between the fibers, that is what we're calling end grain. It's the end of the grain. And so those discs are made into a bunch of little cubes. And yes, typically there is more glue involved in a product like this than an edge grain cutting board, but all those cubes are put together, and the reason it's supposed to be better for longevity of your knife edges as well as edge durability is because as you're cutting into the cutting board, I will keep saying into because that's essentially what happens when your blade meets the cutting board, right? It stops because, well, there's something stopping it, otherwise you'd just be going through it. But as it cuts into the cutting board, at the microscopic level, this one's a little bit more difficult to see at the macroscopic level, but it's cutting between the wood fibers. These are all hardwoods, and the reason this isn't my favorite cutting board, so we'll essentially get that out of the way right away, is because the majority of this end grain, so still better than edge grain, but the majority of this end grain cutting board is in walnut. Walnut is a very dense hardwood. And I find that when I am going to chip a knife, because you can still chip a knife on a really good cutting board, as opposed to the Larchwood Canada board beneath it, I seem to chip my blades a lot more on this. Like, this almost has a reputation. Like, every time I pull this out, I'm like, oh my god, it's so beautiful, I can't wait to cut on it. And I chipped the blade. It must have been my technique. Chipped the blade, it must have been my technique. But there's always a common denominator. It seems to be this walnut cutting board. So I just started thinking, maybe the walnut's just a little bit too dense. And let's see if we can even do a sound test. Try to keep that in your audio library, and we'll do the same with the Larchwood after. But this is very snappy. When the blade hits the board, it doesn't matter who is where in the house, you know that you've reached the end of the line. Whereas the Larchwood cutting board, completely different sound, which tells you a lot more too about the properties of the wood. So this is a beautiful, beautiful cutting board, and it really is. It's gorgeous. It's not like it was cheap. For the size, which is, I think this is probably your standard 18 by 12, 14, I'm not sure. I'll put it in the video description below. So gorgeous, but the reason it's not my favorite cutting board is because I just still find it too hard on the edge of my blades. Now, my favorite cutting board, this is why we're here. This is why the question's been asked over and over and over, is this Larchwood Canada cutting board. Before I talk about why it's my favorite cutting board, like a lot of some of the items that I own, it just so happens that I seem to have acquired them by luck, not because I was knowledgeable about the product. AKA the River Jump is a such example where Adam at Knifeware in Edmonton thought, this is the type of blade that Frankie would appreciate. It's very unique. And he's not wrong, I love it, but I bought it knowing that it was unique. I bought it because I thought it was attractive and then learned everything about it afterwards. Larchwood Canada, when you tell people this is your favorite cutting board, lots of other people will agree too. But I didn't buy it because at the time I thought that it was a fantastic cutting board. I bought it because at the time when I was using and redeeming my reward miles with Air Miles, I saw this cutting board. I thought it looked really interesting. I looked it up. I did the classic Google. I started to read more and more reviews. I was like, damn, This is a great cutting board company, and Air Miles will send it to me for free, and I'm redeeming my miles for it. So I said, absolutely, I don't see why not. To make matters even sweeter, I received it slightly damaged. You'll never see it on the video because it's always on the other side. See that right there? And so I, of course, complained to Air Miles because Air Miles are not cheap to acquire because you got to spend a lot of money. And I said, you know, I've been really excited to get this cutting board. It arrived damaged. So they refunded 30% of my reward miles back, and I was a happy camper. What's special about this cutting board? Why is it my favorite cutting board? It is my favorite cutting board for many reasons, but the main reason is the same reasons I said you should have a good cutting board. Because I care about my edge retention, durability, and I try to avoid cutting on a surface that may make my knives more susceptible to damage. Let's talk about Larchwood, Canada. I believe their headquarters is Wolfville, Nova Scotia. I've been there many times. Some of the best shows we've played back in the punk rock band days were actually in Wolfville. And so that's not why it's my favorite, because it's Canadian like me. It's my favorite because this is a really smart conception and design product that is uber functional. So let's talk about Larchwood. Larchwood is a softwood. Walnut, maple, and cherry are hardwoods. Maple, cherry, and walnut are all hardwood trees that typically reproduce through flowers, right? They create fruit through flowers, through pollinators. Softwood, those are the trees you would think of with cones. That's typically how they reproduce. I say typically, really it's all the time, it's biology, but it's just a matter of saying things. I don't like saying 100% and 0%, so I use the word typically, but in this case, it's science. Reproduce through pollination, reproduce through cones and seeds. Anyhow, that aside, Larchwood is also known as tamarack. It is the only softwood. Now, softwoods typically are trees that are non-deciduous, so they don't lose their leaves, but tamarack or larchwood does. The scientific name for this tree is also Larix laricina. Because it is a softwood, without getting too much into the details, but softwood versus hardwood, I think you can start to figure it out. It's literally softer on the edges of my blade. So it's end grain, just like this Beau Grain. But unlike the Beau Grain, it is so much softer on the edge of my blade. That's constructed in very much the same manner, except this one is just larchwood as the wood used for the cutting board. It's roughly the same size, but I prefer it because every time I cut into it, it just feels like I have this little pillow. Like someone's running saying, I know how much you love this knife, wait, we don't want to damage it. And just puts a little pillow right underneath the blade edge. It's so easy to take care of. The way I take care of all my wooden cutting boards is first of the month. Sometimes, I don't want to say without fail, sometimes I screw up and it's maybe a week later, but I will baby them with a mineral oil and beeswax compound to keep it moist and to trap that moisture within the board, which is again the reason that I have a high quality polyurethane board for things like my raw meats, because those, I don't care how hot the water is and how much soap I put on it, it's not going to damage the wood. These are still in a way living products, right? So the end grain cutting board will be better than my edge grain cutting board. So let's recapitulate. I have many cutting boards. I don't own all cutting boards, but I have a favorite cutting board, and that favorite cutting board is this Larchwood Canada end grain cutting board. Larchwood also stands for, I guess, is equivalent to tamarack or Larix laricina. And in fact, as I say that, I'm recognizing one of the main reasons I love this board, which I forgot to mention. Larix laricina, or tamarack, or larchwood, is a soft wood with antimicrobial properties built within the wood. It's naturally part of the wood. It's a natural property. It's inherent. It is born with it. You have nothing to do to treat the wood to make it antimicrobial. It is naturally antimicrobial, and in fact, it is so strongly antimicrobial that it is the second strongest antimicrobial wood of all the woods out there. The first being a drumroll. The winner is cedar. In the old days, you go to old homes, still today, you will find cedar cabinets. Well, I'm not sure why I'm pointing here. No cedar cabinets here. But cedar cabinets were a popular wood choice for cabinets because depending on the climate you live in, the point is it doesn't matter where you live, there's going to be a variance sometimes in the moisture regime in your home. And so to not have fungus grow within your cabinets, which is something that is very plausible, to not have some type of mite burrow within it, a wood that is naturally antimicrobial and antifungal is absolutely fantastic. And in a food setting, it is even better. Of course, again, I have told you that yes, in my case, I mainly cut vegetables. But I do cut meat every once in a while because I think it's an attractive board. So I'll pull out, say, beef Wellington a few days from now, and I might cut it on this board because I think it's super sexy. And if I don't do a great job at washing some of that blood runoff out of the beef Wellington, well, you know what, it might seep into here, but it's not going to lead to any microbial infection or rot because it is antimicrobial. I really do think that's one of the sellers for Larchwood. Now, if there's one thing I could change about this board, two things. It's actually really simple, and none of them are really Larchwood Canada's fault. I would like a slightly larger board because sometimes when I'm making a salad, I tend to just kind of keep all the ingredients here and then throw it into a big bowl. Case in point, tonight I am having salad. This is a very large bowl. Other times, I do put things into smaller stainless steel bowls. So I would like to have a larger cutting board, which Larchwood Canada does offer. And the second thing that I would change is I do find it attractive, and many people do, but I have seen they have some series of cutting board that I can't remember what they call it. It's random pattern or chaos pattern. It's just less uniform, a little bit more chaotic. If you take a look at the top of this cutting board, you can really see the curvature in the rings. You can almost put them together and create the trunk from that top-down view. I do really like their chaotic pattern because, I don't know, maybe as an artist, I just think it looks cooler. So again, none of that has to do with, that's not a diss on Larchwood Canada, that's a personal preference. And so there you have it. I finally answered the question, what is my favorite cutting board? From now on, when people ask me, you bet I'm going to tell them, I have a video, here's the link. If you guys like the content, please remember to like and subscribe. We're going into 2023 with a bang answering those questions that you have for me. As usual, if you have questions, come find me on Instagram. I take all of your comments seriously. I put them in an Excel spreadsheet, and when I finally knock them out of the park and I'm like, I've answered this person's question, I feel good, I move on. I got lots of content, lots of videos to do. I do promise this year we'll have some type of a river jump knife review. I know lots of you have been asking about that too, but until then, I would say stay sharp, but I'm not holding a knife in hand. Until then, see you next time.